Hey, Comp Govers. So, welcome to Online CompGov. So, I'm going to just restart this frame. You guys are going to be doing the regular frames. Y'all should have all of Nigeria's frames, and I'll upload them as well under Nigeria in case you don't have them. I'm also going to, and it's not quite up yet, but I'm going to do an online fillable frame. So, check for that coming up for Iran. Okay, so I'm gonna restart this frame just so that I have all Nigeria videoed. And I'm hoping to have about 3 videos up a week, maybe 4, depending on the size. And all you need to do is just listen to the video, keep up with the frame, and hopefully you'll have all the content you're gonna need for the APUSH exam or for the CompGov exam. All right, guys, so we're starting Nigeria. And so Nigeria is an interesting case because it is one of the most populous of the African nations. It also does truly represent a lot of the experiences that many of the African nations have gone through as a result of colonialization by the European powers in the 1800s. And for Nigeria, the British have influenced and controlled over what will become Nigeria, which technically is Africa's most populous country. And it has suffered the repercussions of the legacy of colonialism. A series of constitutions after World War II granted Nigeria greater autonomy. And technically, they got their independence in 1960 from the British. But, as we all know, democracies are fragile, and politics in Nigeria were marked by coups and mostly military rule until the death of a military head of state in 1998 allowed for a political transition. In 1999, we're going to see a new constitution was adopted and a peaceful transition to civilian government was completed. The government, though, is going to continue to face the task of institutionalizing democracy. In other words, like we saw in Mexico, we're going to start to see the attempt, although not as successful, of the democratization of Nigeria. So, another major problem, in addition to democratization, is its economy and reforming a petroleum based economy whose revenues have been squandered through decades of corruption and mismanagement. Um, Nigeria also continues to experience long-standing ethnic and religious tension. So we've got democratization, we've got the reforming of the oil industry, as well as ethnic and religious tension. Although both in the 2003 and the 2007 presidential elections were marred by significant irregularities and violence, Nigeria is currently marked the first civilian to civilian transfer of power in the country's history. Um, National and state elections in 2001 and 2015 were generally regarded as credible. The 2015 election was also heralded for the fact that the then umbrella opposition party, the APC, the All Progressives Congress, defeated the long ruling People's Democratic Party. So think of the PDP, or the People's Democratic Party, kind of like Mexico's version of the PRI, because it was the dominant party since they attempted civilian government in 1999. Um, so presidential and legislative elections were held in early 2019 and deemed broadly free and fair, despite voting irregularities that we'll be talking about later, and in some instances of intimidation and violence. So Muhammadu Buhari, is going to be reelected for his second term, consecutive term. We're going to see that he was one of the dictators in the 1980s that will be overthrown, and he will then be democratically elected in the 2000s, and again seeking a consecutive term in 2019. Another major theme that we're going to see in Nigeria is going to be prebendalism. And we've kind of talked about it. I've just not given it a political science term. It means political behavior in which the state personally benefits the office holder. So like Putin. The fact that he's president has made him personally wealthy. So that's one of the things that we're going to see among Nigerian presidents is that because they're president, they have become personally wealthy. So let's take a look at Nigeria and where it is. I like to say that it's in the armpit of Nigeria. I'm sorry, of Africa. Its capital is centrally located here in Abuja. But I don't know if you see it, like right here in the kind of armpit of Africa. This is the 2019 Nigerian election results. And as you can see, Nigeria is very much ethnically and politically um, separated. The APC tends to dominate in the north, and the PDP, the traditionally ruling party, in the south. The north is predominantly Muslim, and the south is predominantly not Muslim. It's a variety of different religions, including Christianity. All right, and as you can see, most of Nigeria also has ethnic diversity. And so we'll be going into its various ethnic divisions as we get into our society frame. All right, so let's start with the executive branch. So traditionally, the executive branch has been the most dominant, and it's because of their history of dictatorships. So they got their independence from the British in 1960 and essentially attempted democracy, but they usually end in failure. And they weren't able to successfully transition from one democratic president to another until 1990, 1999. And so, as a result, they're essentially a brand new democracy and, of course, still struggle. So, their executives have mostly been very dominant traditionally, despite the fact that they do have a constitution that does check and balance the president. They essentially started out following the British model in 1960 because they were a British colony with a parliamentary system. But it turned out that it was not very effective for Nigeria because of its ethnic diversity. It lent to an inability for any one party to gain any kind of majority. So they switched then to a presidential system in 1979. So the presidential system, the president is the head of state, the head of government, and commander in chief. And much like the United States, which also has a presidential system, they have 4-year terms with a 2-term limit. So what are some of the powers of the president? They're pretty significant. They're actually in excess, perhaps, to an American president. They appoint all public officials. That's a power that perhaps our U.S. president doesn't necessarily have. So all the public officials, anyone who works in government, bureaucrats, experts, anyone that's hired by the government can be appointed by the president without legislative approval. And so, of course, this makes it so that the president has enough staying power here to feed the patron-client system. And of course, which is why Nigeria has tendencies towards prebendalism. Now, cabinet positions. Cabinet positions are confirmed by the Senate, appointed by the president, but confirmed by the Senate. But with one constitutional constraint that at least one member from each of the 36 states needs to be in the cabinet. And this is making it so that perhaps the various different ethnic groups that occupy these 36 states within Nigeria have equitable voice. All right, so how is a president elected? Yes, they are directly elected. There is no electoral college within Nigeria. So a presidential candidate uh, is essentially in a single member district with majority elections. Um, so if the candidates don't receive at least a majority, 51% of the vote, it goes to a second ballot. So who advances to the second ballot? Well, you have to have gotten at least 25% of the vote from 2/3 of the state. in the first ballot in order to advance to the second ballot. Okay, so what powers do the president have? I said that it's a little bit more than the current U.S. president. The Nigerian president has the power to veto, um, the essentially the power to decide whether a law is constitutional in terms of judicial review. So, how does the Constitutional Court, or essentially Nigerian Supreme Court, determine the constitutionality of any legislation? Well, it needs to originate with the president. The president has to refer the bill. In the United States, it's the court, the Supreme Court, that actually chooses whether they're going to issue a ruling on anything. So, this is a unique power of the president. The president can also call the National Assembly, which is the Congress. This is their Congress. So they can call National Assembly for any special session. Usually in the United States, it's the power of at least in the House, of the Speaker of the House. Can pardon criminals for criminal cases, much like the American presidents. And they're here. I forgot to mention this is Buhari, and he is currently in his second term. He was elected with the APC, oppositional party, that upset the dominant PDP party in the 2015 and now 2019 election. He is Muslim. He is from the north. He is a retired general and did serve as president, as a presidential dictator between 1983 and 1985. He actually seized power in 83 and then was overthrown in 85. But because of his military background and his strength, many Nigerians felt that in 2015 that he was strong enough to solidify the country of Nigeria, that has been characterized since 1999 as being very much in chaos and turmoil. And so, because of his military background, people thought he was strong enough to be able to unite Nigeria in 2015, won a second election just last February. All right, the legislature. The legislature in Nigeria is called the National Assembly. It is bicameral, and it's weak. It's because of its history of an authoritarian dictatorship. So, of course, the legislature is going to take a back seat. Um, so that is one characteristic of the Nigerian Congress. The second is that the Congress, or the National Assembly, reflects regional representation. So, as we know, there are 36 states within Nigeria, and they do reflect majority ethnic groups. And so these ethnic representations are reflected in the Congress. All right. So these members to Congress are directly elected to a 4-year term, but unlike the presidency, there are no term limits. So, what is the powers of both of the houses? Well, they basically have the same power, the same legislative power. There is two exceptions. The Senate can impeach judges and executive commissions. That is, with presidential recommendation. And the Senate can also confirm the president's cabinet, which we had already said. So these are two more powers than what the House has. And yeah, by the way, they do call it the Senate and the House, just like in the United States. So what is the state of the Nigerian legislature today? Well, it's under a learning curve right now because it's relatively new. It's only been under a civilian government for maybe about a decade, and so it's still struggling to find its feet. Um, so, for example, we see some weaknesses sometimes that the National Assembly has shown, and then some strengths. For example, weakness. In 2007, the PDP majority in Congress were still waiting President Jonathan, this is good luck Jonathan, more on him later, signature or veto by the time he left office. Like they were still waiting in 2015 for any legislation to be essentially passed by the Congress to be signed, that went out in 2007. So it's almost like, well, if it wasn't signed by the president, it's no longer in it's it's really not valid. So does that mean the Nigerian legislature is invalid because um in 2015 when he leaves office, a lot of these pieces of legislation passed by the Congress weren't even signed. So that shows weakness. But then, subsequent to Jonathan, good luck, Jonathan, President Obasanjo attempted to alter the Constitution to run for a third term, essentially um, getting rid of the two-term limit when Congress, even his own party, stood up against him and prevented uh, a dismissal of the two-term limit. So again, that's strength by the Nigerian legislature. So it's kind of a mixed bag, and they're still under a learning curve. So, how do both houses get elected? Well, they are both single-member districts. They are elected by first past the post, meaning there's no runoff. The first candidate that gets to the finish line, right? It's the one who has one more vote than the other guy, then that person wins. And as we said before, the legislature in both houses does reflect regional ethnic groups, wide variety of ethnicities. The problem is that because they're so different, forming coalitions, caucuses to get legislation through has been very difficult for this diverse Congress, and it has essentially been seen as very weak as a result. All right, so let's break these two into houses. The Senate. The Senate has 106 senators. That's three from each of the 36 states, plus Abuja, which is the district, the federal district. So whereas the United States does two plus from DC, Nigeria does three plus from their version of DC, which is Abuja. Senators, like I've said, and I keep reminding you that one of the biggest problems Nigeria faces is division. And so senators are ethnically and religiously diverse. And we are also seeing very few women. So the patriarchy is very strong in Nigeria. Only 709 senators were women in 2015, and that number went down in the 2019 election due to some problems that the 2019 election faced. More on that later. Okay, so they also have a House of Representatives. This is 360 members to the House of Representatives. It's based on population, just like in the United States. In this case, 22 of the 360 representatives were women, and that number also go down in 2019. So, uh, not a great place to be a woman. All right, here are the 2019 election results, and as you can see, no, these are the 2015 election results. And as you can see here, the All Progressives Party or All Progressives Congress, they do dominate right now. Also in the House, same deal. All right, judiciary. So this is a dual federal state court system. So they have courts at the state level, the 36 states, and at the federal level. Now, what complicates things for Nigeria and things that make it different from the United States is that they do, particularly the northern Nigerian states, practice Sharia law. So there are some Sharia courts in 12 of the northern states. So I'll be talking about that in just a moment. But let's go first into just kind of their structure. So the court, the judiciary court system does operate at the local, state, and federal level. So it tends to be what is often referred to as a dual court system. And it's headed by a federal court of appeals. So they do have a court of appeals. So if something doesn't go your way at a lower court, you can go up to a federal court of appeals. But the highest court is the Supreme Court. And there are 15 appointed justices. The Constitution allows for up to 21. Right now, there are 15 appointed justices, whereas in the United States, that number is less. We have 9. But what is different between U.S. justices and Nigerian justices is essentially uh, qualifications. Most of the Nigerian judges lack training, they lack even a law degree. So the court systems has often been used by the Nigerian presidents to essentially put their cronies, their friends, their, in order to feed the patronage. So not necessarily qualified. So the courts have traditionally been seen as corrupt. So the Nigerian law system does mirror the British system of common law, but again, this whole thing is complicated because of Sharia. And I'll get to that in the next slide. But largely, the judiciary system is historically very corrupt. It has been stripped of power, often by military decrees, by authoritarian dictators. At times, judicial review was suspended. So this the court system does not have a great history in Nigeria. So today, the judiciary is responsible for interpreting the law in accordance with the Constitution. So technically, judicial review exists, but it's just not commonly exercised. And as we saw in China, usually when they're instituting some types of reform measures politically, it's the judicial branch that is last to experience these reforms, although very important for foreign business. All right, so let's talk about Sharia law. So I don't know if you know much about Sharia law. It is basically Islamic law based on the Quran. And so there are certain laws that are in the Quran that many of the northern states within Nigeria will practice. And so 12 of the northern states have instituted a system of Sharia courts for cases involving only Muslims, usually with regard to customary disputes. So this isn't necessarily criminal or anything like that. These are just kind of disputes. Um, so there are Sharia courts that run parallel to state courts. So they have two different courts in these 12 states. Now, in these state courts or non-Muslim courts, can also establish a court. So, for example, say you subscribe to a certain um, ethnicity, right? That is, or a certain religion, and it's not Muslim. You can also establish a court that deals with customary issues based on your local traditions. So we call them Sharia courts, but sometimes they cannot necessarily be Sharia courts, but rather just simply customary courts that are not state courts, but non-Muslim courts that deal with local traditions. All right, so that's the more customary disputes. Now the secular courts. Those state courts do retain supreme jurisdiction if a conflict arises. So, taking precedent is going to be the secular court, the state court, as opposed to Sharia or other type of non-Muslim court. There is a Sharia Court of Appeals at the federal level, so outside of the states, we do see this. It's not designated by the Constitution, so it does remain controversial, but it does exist and is being used. All right, so here are the 12 states where Sharia law is in force. Their legal system, it's mixed with English common law, Islamic law, and traditional law. So it is a mixed legal system. Okay, so that ends our frame for today. I'm hoping to put more videos up as I can get to them. All right, stay safe, guys. Bye.